back to Necropolis AD show. Nads. You're here at the Nads. We all have the Nads here. We're fisting the Jesus. Well, for Nads. So today we just have another round table for you guys. More focus on the extreme metal than the last episode, which was more about just fucking hell, the world that we live in. But we'll be focusing straight about the cultural and background influences on extreme metal. So everything that kind of generated extreme metal from a societal standpoint, we'll be analyzing that, as well as delving into trueness and authenticity. So I want to thank Jakob returning. Jakob, the Danish philosopher and artist.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. We also have Paul from the Texas death metal band Condemner. Thank you for coming back, Paul.
Hello again. Good to be back.
Yep, and back from that Destroying Texas festival. And we also have Sodomizer, a.k.a. Brett Stevens from deathmetal.org, America.org, author of Nihilism. Thank you, sir, for returning.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure as always.
Yeah, so when we're discussing the cultural influences on extreme metal, like where it came from and all that, like I guess we got to start with Black Sabbath, even though we consider Black Sabbath kind of like a proto-metal band because there's still a lot of hard rock influences, but they were from the bourgeois class, essentially. They weren't, part of, I believe like their families were like factory workers and all that. So I'll start with you, Mr. Stevens. I know you've written quite a bit about the cultural and societal aspects that surrounded the metal scene. What do you think would be like what the main thing that created metal? I know there's probably a lot of different factors that came into play, but when you look at Black Sabbath, they're kind of like the pre-Socratic philosophers are kind of describing the horrors of reality. What do you think the main cultural influence is on metal?
Well, I think that it was in part based within rock music itself, a rejection of the hippie era. I think the working class aspects of Black Sabbath mostly came into play when they were watching these people who clearly didn't have to work for a living, flouncing around and doing hippie stuff and preaching peace and love. And in the meantime, these guys were working in factories, and getting fingers sliced off while they were doing this, and had a more realistic approach to life because they had to adapt on a daily basis to the brutal reality of British socialism, basically, which was that the industry wasn't coming back, jobs were hard, and expenses were high. And while everyone seemed to be on the dole, nobody seemed to be really making it that much. But I think this sort of came to the fore in the context of a very uniquely British culture, which is one of, I would say, warlike assertion and the attempt to actually get to the core of an issue and be bloody-minded about it instead of just dancing around the surface. The UK scene was much less infested with politics than the American scene, which was much more about lowercase p politics or manipulating people. It was more like a sales job. And I think in this case, the strong British culture, the sense of having a right way to do things, of having order, of having a sort of a path through life where there was a pattern that existed from birth to death and you integrated with the community. The idea, even though they were from industrial cities, these were subdivided into smaller places. The idea of village life, I think, is very prevalent in Black Sabbath. But those are the main influences I see as far as background. The most direct influence that seems consistent in everything, in all of their iconography, in all of their biographies, in their lyrics, and in their expression, is horror movies. And I think this is where you put your finger on it. They were interested in the dark side of life because you have to go through that to get to the good. You cannot simply divide the world into good and evil like they do in the churches and filter out the evil and then only have good. You have to accept that life is a mixed bag, find out why it's that way, because there's logical reasons why it must be that way, and from that construct goodness out of sort of fitting in with the larger order and maximizing what you can. And I think that's very much in the British spirit. It always has been. It's how they were able to basically conquer most of the world, is that they had this extremely realistic but also transcendental idealistic view, sort of like the Germans did, and even the Romans. They saw the world as a mixed bag, but they saw it as a beautiful opportunity to do great things, and so they aspired to that. And I think that kind of ambition infused Sabbath at a time when everybody else was sort of being a clone of The Who or Cream or one of those other associated bands. I don't know if I got the timing exactly right on those names, but that movement of heavy rock. So Black Sabbath incorporated the Jethro Tull influence, which I think is incredibly understated. They incorporated other progressive influences, a lot from horror movie music and a lot of their own weirdness. But they had this vision, and this is very British, of the stiff upper lip, of just having a cup of hot tea and getting on with things. And that, I think, got them past the hippie era. And this is very similar to the other band that I would say came in and was a huge influence on Black Sabbath, though it's harder to trace, but also on the rising metal movement, and that was the Stooges, from a similar background in Michigan. These were people who were dealing with the dark underside of modern society, and though the televisions were full of hippies flouncing around doing their thing, they weren't seeing this reality working for them. And they came from a very hard scrabble culture, which emphasized doing practical things about problems in life and not shying away from them. And so that's a heavy part of Anglo-Saxon culture, and it's a huge part of even modern Britain. And I think that influenced the direction they took at a time when it would have been easier for them to be just another heavy blues rock clone band.
Yeah, excellent summary there. Way more in depth than I could ever go into the sociology surrounding the birth of metal. Jacob, you initially wanted to delve into the whole culture of metal. Would you agree with the sentiments that Mr. Sodomizer said there about like the warrior assertion, the rejection of the hippies and all that kind of form like what would be known as metal?
Oh yes, most definitely. But I would add to that, and I'm of course speaking as a Scandinavian here. When extreme metal came to fruition, and we got the Swedish and the Norwegian scenes, from the late 80s and up into the 90s, you saw something which was really quite remarkable, I think, for a musical subculture, namely the way that the metal blueprint, which was of course established by Black Sabbath and the heavy metal traditional bands of the 70s and 80s, and I won't go too much into that because that's not really an area of expertise for me, but with the push for extremity and the expansion of metal as sort of a global underground subculture, you got these highly specialized forms of expression from Sweden, for example, or Norway, where you can really you can hear the genealogy of the metal that preceded these voices, but you also get a strong sense of a national, I won't call it identity because it's more intuitive than being, something done consciously. It's more like the music is taking shape in accordance with some of the more ethereal aspects of being Swedish or being Norwegian. Or I know there's an interesting way that sort of like an almost folkish sense, but of shaping riffs and crafting songs from these genetic elements. But in the push towards extremity, you get a whole new form of expression, which at the same time can feel almost ancient. When you live here, for example, you can hear the reminiscences of something that is only. It's very hard to make a sort of clear-cut intellectual point about exactly what it is. But for example, when I was a kid, we used to take these hiking vacations to Norway, where we would spend weeks hiking in the Norwegian mountains. And when I later discovered Norwegian black metal, there was something that really reminded me of being in those landscapes and that awe-inspiring sense of being dwarfed by those mighty mountains and having this acute sense of being in a natural landscape, which has this sort of inherent, almost primordial, extreme power that dwarfs you as an individual. And when you are aware of these things, then you can really see how that sort of inspiration resonates towards the way that the Norwegians crafted their riffs, for example. So that was my initial idea that I thought would be really interesting to explore. Also because Brett had the original proposition of exploring why was early Swedish death metal so fucking awesome, and I think that this was really one of the main reasons that it was so fucking awesome was the fact that it was an underground culture, an underground form of expression that managed to sort of seep up almost like subconscious influences from the culture surrounded it and giving it a voice in a totally new way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You brought up the folk element of the Norwegian mountains. Have you ever heard of the composer? I might butcher his name. Geir Tvedt. He was a Norwegian composer who actually went around the Hardanger area and collected a lot of folk music, and he transcribed that for orchestra. But even like, when he was composing in the 40s and 50s, very, very strong nationalist side. He was also a national socialist, blah, blah, blah. But Norway seemed to come back around to him. They're actually exploring a lot of his works that have survived. What I mean by surviving, a good chunk of his compositions were lost in a fire, which is really unfortunate. But and then he stopped composing and just got turned into an alcoholic after losing much of his life's work. But what survives is there's this a release called 100 Hardanger tunes, and that's a lot of what he transcribed, from Norwegian folk music to full orchestra. And then what's also interesting too is that Ildjarn has that same inspiration, the Hardanger Vida, however you pronounce that.
Yes, Hardanger Vida.
Yeah, the ambient album, that's really cool. I think there's two of them actually, but they were inspired also by like the same aspects of nature and all that. Even though I wouldn't really consider that being really folkish. But how about you, Paul? Do you see any other parallels there with like Jacob mentioned, like there's perhaps a genetic component to people crafting riffs? Do you agree with that sentiment, Paul?
Well, it's weird growing up in Texas, because Texas in many ways is almost the reverse of what Jacob described in Sweden. Because like if you talk to metalheads in Texas, you have a whole bunch of us that were, kids who grew up in very Christian households. And then when we got into metal, had to make a complete break with our old selves. And everything about the metal we make is a complete break with a complete rejection of the very small town Christian Texan values and ideas. It's the reverse of the Swedish thing where it's like, oh yes, this is going to remind me of, some Swedish value. You listen to Texas metal, I always suspect this is why so much of it is so overtly satanic, because it's the exact opposite of when we were growing up and going to church every Sunday and told, don't you go listen to that evil heavy metal like Guns N' Roses. Your soul will go to hell if you listen to that. I mean, it's the opposite of everything that was around us for a lot of us growing up. Genetic component, I don't know, maybe. I mean, I think that's more just being intelligent enough and being predisposed enough to liking music, and then also, having some natural rebellion against what you see as, the stupid fucking Christian status quo. But I don't, at least in Texas, and at least what I have seen locally, I think it's very different than what Jakob has described. Now, Europe may be different because Europe hasn't really been very fundamentalist Christian in many, many, many years. But in Texas, at least, I think the drivers are very different.
I do think, to chime in here, that there was also an element in Sweden and Norway, particularly about, breaking with something of a Christian strain to the culture that these metalheads were growing up under the influence of, more or less. But I think it's true that there's a definite difference between what I reckon. I've never been to the USA, so I've only seen what the typical American Christian culture-ish type of thing is represented via television and stuff like that. And of course, seeing the way that bands like Deicide, for example, made an obvious point of breaking very violently with this. Now, there was also the satanic element to a lot of the Norwegian bands, for example, or maybe primarily Darkthrone. But this was more of I always got the sense that this was more of an esoteric thing, if that makes sense. It was not as much about breaking with a concrete oppressive Christian culture, but more of making a statement of general extreme rebellion against something like, growing up in a very welfare socialist, almost safe type of environment where in reality the kids were getting a whole lot of freedom, and they were told that you are free to do whatever you want, and there's economic safety, and there's no real threats to existence as such. But at the same time, there's a dark undercurrent to this, and I'm speaking here as a Scandinavian as well, because there's sort of like a deep existential anguish almost that underlies this idea of producing the perfectly safe society. And that was also I think a huge factor in the way that they chose to rebel, and by that applying extreme sound but also extreme imagery.
Yeah, here in the South, especially in the U.S., this shit ton of Protestants, and I was raised around a lot of Methodists and Baptists, and can't tell you how many times I've been told I'm going to hell and all that. And I went to a Baptist university where I actually had to formally study the Bible. I had to take Old Testament and New Testament, and I got a B in Old Testament just because I actually enjoyed that. I like God coming down and being very wrathful and killing everybody over and over. And then when I got to the New Testament, I ended up getting into an argument with the professor, and the last paper that I wrote, he gave me a 0 because I was telling him why Christianity's kind of falling out of favor here in the West because it's too passive. And I'm like, if you want true Christianity to survive and all that, you need to be very active and stop turning the other cheek. And he flat out gave me a 0. And but I know Paul had an encounter with the Christians at his university as well. But I think, especially, I know Paul and I, we reached a conclusion pretty early on that Christianity is just a lie. And I went to private schools, got kicked out of the public school sector, and I had a lot of indoctrination at Christian private schools, and I questioned everything. And in the 5th grade, they ended up just sticking my desk out in the hallway outside of the classroom. And I was a little terror and all that. But something is just like the South here in the U.S. is very, very, it's just assumed that, Christianity is like the the faith that everyone has, whereas in reality, they're dwindling a lot. But I even had I forgot one time this guy came up to me and said, "Hey, Jason, you need to go on Christian Mingle and meet a nice woman." I'm like, dude, I'm not going on Christian Mingle. And it's just, it's frustrating being around it. And you look at metal too, and metal was kind of a reaction of the lyrical themes to the Satanic Panic, where you had like Tipper Gore and all that coming out and, just really saying this is, music that's going to corrupt the youth. I think what Paul was saying about the Christian influence here is very, very more pronounced, but more like a Protestant sense. And Protestants tend to be like, they have their own version of Christianity, person by person. Like they have their own perspective on what it means. And most of those people, they haven't even really read the Bible. They can't tell you, 5 books that are in the Bible, but they have their personal relationship with God, quote unquote, and Jesus. And you really can't talk sense into them. It's like they're very, delusional in that aspect. And it's just something about Southern society. That's one of the really frustrating aspects. I know Mr. Brett Stevens here, he likes to fist to Jesus. Do you have any extra sentiments you want to place on the influence of Christianity, the reaction that was very prominent in metal?
Oh, of course. It was a huge part of metal, though I think it came out of the horror movie influence, which really addresses straight on the question of whether or not there is a metaphysical existence. Stanley Kubrick famously said about horror films that he liked them because they gave him hope that there was something beyond death. I always thought that was sort of a cheerful way to look at things. It's like, yeah, there's these demons attacking you, but hey, there's this whole other world that's going to happen to you after you're dead. There's a few different influences here. One thing that I think we can't avoid with Texas is the question of the different ethnic regions of Texas. For example, there's an Anglo region, there's a Czech region, there's a German region, and then there's the Scots-Irish region, which is the Dallas area and thereabout, the areas surrounding it. And I think that when we look at the influence of Christianity, we have to take into account that after almost 1,000 years of religious struggle in Europe, there are very different strains of the philosophy behind Christianity. Your Anglo area was heavily Episcopalian, and they tend to be Calvinistic. They tend to also teach Christianity alongside the Greeks, which has a huge difference in how it's interpreted, in that I think they tend to, instead of trying to fix the world for God's order, I think they tend to see the world as a manifestation of God's order, and therefore things like poverty don't bother them as much. They're not as social justice oriented as the Catholics or other Protestant sects. And I think that has a huge influence on metal in Texas. I would just say that the most immediate influence that we had was that at the time in the 80s when this music came about, Christians who had survived the 1960s were still the dominant authority. So, for example, here, if you wore all black, had an ankh, an upside-down cross, a pentangle, or a pentagram, or any such iconography on your person, you got sent home and you might get paddled. They had a wood or plastic paddle with holes in it to make it travel faster. And
I was paddled quite a bit when I was a kid.
Yeah, I don't think people now have any idea what it was like back then. I mean, and I don't think it was terrible.
It was dying out when I was in school in the 90s. There was only one teacher who still did it regularly back then.
Yeah. It was an 80s thing, but I mean, I think, and before, obviously, it wasn't terrible. I mean, I think that in the sum total, it was good that they paddled people because some kids needed paddling. I don't think it could survive the diversity experience because it was going to be seen as racially biased. And it also probably would have erupted classrooms into violence in general, when the kids started fighting back. But, that was the environment we were rebelling against. There was a very strong culture. And it had been hijacked, so to speak, by Christianity in some ways. But I think for most of the people in the culture, they saw Christianity as their way of keeping people away from really relentless individualism. This turns out to be a mistake because, of course, Christianity is heavily individualistic, more so than most of the other big religions that aren't from the Abrahamic area. But that was what they were trying to do. They were trying to hold together their culture under, massive onslaught from many different angles. And as a result, they tended to crack down really hard on things that were deviant in a way that they saw as demonic. And this was literally the term they used for it. They said things were demonic or satanic. And this was the environment into which the satanic panic came, which, like our current Epstein crisis over quote-unquote pedophilia, is sort of the general idea that our society is degenerating and it's destroying our children. But that's very amorphous when you express it in theory, so you have to put it into some sort of image. It's like Hansel and Gretel kicking the witch into the oven. You need a visual image that people can associate with, that they can make sense out of. And when the 80s dawned and the PMRC came about with Tipper Gore and all of those associated lunatics, what they were trying to do was hold together a culture that they viewed as fragmenting. And for metal, it was hard because what was fragmenting the culture was probably most properly the hippie era, among other things. And metal was against both that and the dominant culture, arguing in its own way that we needed to return to an older culture, that we needed to get back towards something, and they wouldn't say it at the time, but more pagan. We like blood sacrifice. We like the lex talionis. We like the idea of good to the good and bad to the bad. We like the idea of balance. And we're also kind of cool with natural selection. You grow up in Texas, you always know some kid who has to pick up the rattlesnake 4 miles from home, and you go to his funeral and you think, well, he really wasn't the brightest light. So this isn't terrible, this is probably the order of nature expressing itself. And I've even seen some parents sort of, nod to that after their kid managed to die of something stupid. It's like, well, he really wasn't that bright, and this probably is sort of the order of things. So I think that was sort of coming about, was this backlash against the hippies and the hippies as well. And in Texas, it expressed itself intensely through the satanic vibe, because that was such a trigger issue, and because it was such a powerful metaphor for paganism itself. When you say, I embrace Satan, you're saying, among other things, I reject the binary of good and evil, and I embrace the lex talionis, the law of revenge, which translated into practical terms simply means good to the good and bad to the bad. That instead of trying to reform the bad the way the Christians do, instead of trying to look for inspiring stories where the homeless guy, gets off crack and suddenly becomes a productive member of society by selling, hand-carved trinkets or something, you recognize that Darwin was right and Blake was right, and some are born to sweet delight and some are born to the endless night. And you kind of want to be in favor of filtering out the endless night people, because miserable people make other people miserable. It's all they do. And I would say this is the shadow ideology behind metal, was just a giant middle finger to all of this attempt to make the bad good, a pacifistic attempt, basically, to get along with things that were dysfunctional and defective, and instead to start asserting what was true and real, derived from nature instead of from the gods. Of course, I don't think metal bands articulated this. I don't think anyone really could. It's taken us, 30 years of sort of ruminating over it to get to the point where we have some clarity on this issue at all. But that's sort of where the culture war came into metal, as far as I could see. And, it's really interesting, following what Jakob said. Your culture is invisible to you. As people said about this in the past, a fish doesn't notice it's in water. It just influences how you think. And to me, it was very clear that Swedish metal had an intense cultural influence because their approach was so different. At the time when most metal bands were aiming for brutality, for extreme chromatic riffing that just sort of thudded against each other and tried to be faster and harder and heavier and more E chords than anyone else, the Swedes looked at it from like, well, how can I write melodies into this? And I think, based on my limited exposure to Swedish folk music, they also liked phrasal riffs, which are very much in common between classical-derived horror movie soundtracks, Swedish folk music, Finnish folk music, and English and Scottish folk music. They're not like rock music where you just sort of strum chords and the vocals do all the work. You have multiple instruments playing these melodies and harmonizing those, and the vocals almost take more of a background because they're sort of following the instruments a little more. They're still vocal led, but I think you have that texture of, riffing and of internal melodies to the strings. You can see it in country music where you'll have, the guitar going and they're sort of doing some lead picking, some chord strumming, and then there's a violin harmonizing with that, and maybe some other stuff going on in the background. I don't know if they use mandolins or ukuleles or whatever, but anyway, I think that all of those influences came in, and in the Swedish approach, they were seeking to write melodic riffs and put them together in a way that told a story, like a folk song or like some of the epic songs. We know that the Greek plays were sung. There was music accompanying the words, and these were often sung as well, and you had your chorus singing them. And I think that's the influence. I think we've got something very ancient coming out in metal music after the initial onslaught of 1950s and 1960s rock, which really was just sort of rebranded country music. And that country music is mostly of an Anglo-Scottish origin. So metal was sort of trying to reform this, take it in a new direction. This is completely consistent with what the progressives were trying to do, and also what the punks were trying to do. Iggy and the Stooges, Iggy said he wanted to be remembered as, basically a middle finger to the hippie era. The Ramones guitarist said he wanted to be remembered for having created a pure white blues that was sort of a counterpoint to what was on the radio. And I think all these guys were sort of looking at trying to get rock and roll out of what it had become, which was this very predictable product. And of course, cynics like me say it was always a product. You productify country music and standardize it and put it on the new cheap vinyl, and you can sell it to kids and make millions of dollars. But I think that this backlash that came out of metal, it was different than other rebellion movements because it really had its own goal other than just a middle finger in the air. And I think that's why metal has always been an outlier, in that it has a creative impulse as well as a negative impulse. And this will always make it an outlier because I think it competes with other genres and shows them up. It makes them look a little thin because it's got so much going on. And when I look at the early Swedish bands, like Carnage, or Therion, or At the Gates, you can see there's an influence of a different approach toward music that is more like something folk-based, but not like American folk, hippie folk, which was a whole lot of strumming, repetitive stuff, and wailing. It was in a musical level. They wanted to have something going on in the strings, and they were okay with the vocals being much more backgrounded. And in fact, they got rid of them entirely, just about, other than as a rhythm instrument. And this came through the interesting proof of this, like Carnage, if memory serves, that band wasn't all comprised of metalheads. That was Discharge fans, some metalheads, and some people who I think were general music fans, but weren't necessarily, Hessians through and through. So that's got to be a cultural influence if it comes in through all of those inputs, and it cannot strictly be the invention of the band. So that's where I'd say, Texas and Sweden have something in common, in that we are expressing an ancient culture that we live by because we live in harsh places. And that if it takes a form of something satanic or occult or demonic, that may be in part rebellion against the status quo, but I think it's actually a philosophical argument saying we don't believe in good and evil, we believe in smart versus stupid. So that's my 2 cents there.
Just 2 cents? That was more like 50 cents. All right, Jacob, any retorts to what Mr. Stevens said? I know you really wanted to get into the host cultures and all that, and we chimed a little bit about Swedish death metal. I love that Carnage and early Dismember more than At the Gates, but that's an argument for another day. At the Gates is one of those bands that I've tried. I like Gardens of Grief better than The Red in the Sky, but still, it's one of those bands that hasn't really clicked for me. How about you, Jacob? Do you want to delve further into that Swedish death metal?
Oh, yes.
I think it was interesting, Brett mentioning that Carnage album, because I was listening to it just the other day, and I was sort of contemplating also the fact that this episode was upcoming, and I got lost in one of those, there was like, a straightforward drum beat, and you had one of those on surface level, pretty basic riffs, chromatic power chording, 4 chords or something like that. And it struck me the way that this, from a technical standpoint, this would be like a basic hardcore riff. But Carnage on that album, Dark Recollections, were able to infuse even these basic hardcore riffs with something like there's almost a certain song or swing to the way that the chords resonate with each other and the way that they fall on the beat. And I was like, hey, wait a minute, what is this? And then I thought, let me just go and check on YouTube. I found a recital by a classical Swedish poet, or he was a surrealist, but he was called Gunnar Öklöf, and you could hear sort of in the way that the Swedish language has sort of like a little melody to it. It was almost like that same sort of swung, in lack of a better term, were present in the way that they infused these hardcore riffs to give it sort of like a very strong character. And it's really, from a technical standpoint, it's not a lot different from some of the riffs that Napalm Death were using or something like that. But the way that they are put together and the way that they resonate with each other, they create this sort of what I can only call a Swedish vibe. Also, and I was listening to this poet, the way that he was speaking, he was reciting the poem, and it was like this about fascination with darkness. Also, a strong current in Swedish literature, for example, or Scandinavian literature as such. There was almost like what can only be described as a cultural influence, which was so rooted in a Swedishness. So it can't be reduced to technicalities, something like that. It's a way of doing things. It's a way of looking at the world almost, where you can see that, okay, these bands, Carnage would find these riffs appealing because they had sort of like a Swedish ear for the riff, if that makes sense.
That's very interesting. I've never thought about it that way before. Like the language itself, like there's kind of, like you're saying, it's kind of toneful. Like there's a cadence to the language that's translated to the guitar riffs.
Yeah, so if you look at something like New York death metal, for example, a band like Suffocation or Immolation, they have like this intense relation to rhythmic, what do you call it, accentuation, which is totally alien to the way that the Swedes were doing things. Both approaches are distinctly death metal, but very, very different in outcomes.
Oh, Paul, I know you're a guitar guy. Do you want to chime in on that?
So the way I've always heard Swedish death metal, with the exception, it has to be said, of At the Gates, they do not fall into the trend I'm about to describe, but almost all of the rest of it, in my experience, is basically D-beat punk guys, as Brett pointed out, who actually know something about real music theory. Because one thing that is different in the U.S. versus Sweden is that in the U.S., musical education for children is absolutely pathetic. Like, if you are lucky, you will at some point learn how to play recorder at the level of, here is where to put your fingers and blow into the thing when you see this note on the staff. That is the depth as far as you will get with music in the U.S. learning it as a kid. In most of Europe, they have actual musical education, is my understanding. And so what happens if you take a bunch of D-beat punk, but you have D-beat punk kids, who also were educated in actual music at some point? The answer is you combine those things and you get something that sounds a whole lot like Unleashed or like Nihilist or like Entombed. If you follow the rhythms of any of that stuff, it's always that's just straight D beat. And then you basically take this, you put on it a tonality that is very, very close to fairly standard diatonic tonality with some chromatic notes here and there as thrown in as color. And you basically, you put those two together and you now have Swedish death metal for the most part. Again, At the Gates being the huge exception to this. Are there cultural influences? There might be, but I don't know that that's what I hear so much. I think it really is that punk influence that Brett noted comes up a whole lot.
Yeah, that's more of the empirical stance. I think Jacob's interpretation was more like, he said ethereal, so more like perhaps the intuition of the language, speaking Swedish, being raised around that, where it's just part of your being, as you don't really think about it. It just comes out. May have influence how the riffs communicate on a more intuitive level than perhaps empirical music theory side. How about you, Mr. Stevens? Do you agree, disagree? Is there a middle ground between the two approaches?
Well, I think that metal itself is a fusion of proto-punk, progressive, and heavy rock with horror movie soundtracks, which has a heavy classical influence, Wagner, Bruckner, and other moderns, Sanson as well. So, in that context, what makes Swedish metal different, Swedish death metal different? To me, it's that they took a melodic approach that wasn't simply decoration. And we have to look not at the riffs themselves, but how they interact with each other. And there is that storytelling aspect, the phrasal through composed approach that we also saw in some black metal, which tends toward a different presentation and effect than even Discharge could do. I mean, I thoroughly enjoy that first Discharge album. I would challenge anyone not to. But the fact is that it was very much verse chorus, and they even had solos, aimed sort of at that standard song format, and was okay with each riff sort of holding ground on its own. Where I think with your Swedish death metal, you saw, and European death metal in general, you saw an awful lot more knitting of riffs together to kind of make things flow. You see that in Morbid Angel as well. You see it in Slayer. But, so maybe it is an IQ filter to some degree. But I think there is a distinctly Swedish approach in that there's a balance between the melody, the rhythms, the amount of percussive strumming, the amount of tremolo, how everything balances out. And as a whole, when you look at these compositions as contextures, you see that the emphasis is on making the riffs work with each other, and there's less of the one big riff emphasis. And that gives it sort of the ability to have more of a voice than it would if it were just straight hardcore. I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed the greats of hardcore, listen to the Cro-Mags all the time, Discharge, even some of the earlier stuff like the Stooges I can enjoy. The Ramones are a little candy pop, I'll say that. But, hardcore is very much in the rock model. It was really designed to reconquer rock from a garage band, a garage rock approach. And the metal genre broke free from that. And I think where the Swedes came in was they visualized this on a grander scale. It was more Wagnerian. And I would say that there is a cultural influence to the way they wrote melodies, even though they're extremely basic. There's a tendency in sort of big rock and roll when you write melodies to emphasize the color notes and expand space and that kind of thing. And I would say your standard Swedish riff aims to take space and then channel it into something. It starts broad and gets narrow and then fits into other riffs, and this creates more of a topographic sense that I would say is closer to what prog rock was attempting to do. It's very interesting to me that so many of the Scandinavian musicians, when you finally get them drunk enough to tell you what they actually listen to, they admit that their parents' record collections tended to have a lot of prog rock and Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk and stuff like that in them. And I think there's more of that sensibility of space, of using melody, and of viewing the song as a composition in itself instead of just matching together a couple riffs that work in the rock and roll and pop cycle. The 3-minute song with adornments and additions. So I would say you can hear something like a cultural influence in Swedish metal, and it's distinctive. to the point where people actually from all over the world have emulated it. Because let's face it, everybody wants to be Dismember on that first album. I challenge you to find a metalhead who does not. And I think that comes out. It's got its own voice and its own sound. And I can second Jacob's point that I can see how it follows Swedish as a language, because it's got a similar sing-song approach with some odd endings. When I watch Swedish TV, which I frequently do because I can't stand much TV, and I love good detective noir where there's a brutal murder, and Nord Noir is where it's at, if you know what I mean for that. It's interesting to me how, like Latin and like German, though not done through grammar, their sentences are sort of designed as wholes. When they speak a complex grammar, it changes the pronunciation of certain words, like at the beginning and throughout the course of the sentence. And I think there's a lot of subtle cues in there. And I think that's in part what Jacob's talking about in these phrases, in these riffs. There's often just odd rhythmic accents and sort of odd use of swing at certain times that to me resembles what I know as an outsider with no training of the Scandinavian languages. And I think that though we don't see it as such in America, I think that pronunciation is a very powerful grammatical clue and guide to the listener, and also conveys a lot of emotion that you're not going to recognize until your third season of watching a detective show in Swedish. So I got to say that while I think Paul's analysis is correct from a technical aspect, when you look at how those technical pieces are combined and the influences in them that we don't really have vocabulary for necessarily technically, you see something that is like a cultural and linguistic influence from the Swedes. And it certainly made something that sounds distinctive above all else. Even when we attempt to clone it using known techniques, it doesn't quite fit together. So I think that's a cultural influence there.
Yeah, another cultural influence that just jumped in my head here is, I went to Finland a couple years ago. I hung out with Marco Leho, went to Steelfest and all that fun stuff. What I noticed in Finland is everyone is very, I don't want to use the word cold, but they're not as chatty as Americans are. They only say something when they have something to say. There's no small talk. But when it comes to the Swedes, I believe the Swedes are more chatty than the Finns and the Norwegians. But they're also more intimate with each other because they go in saunas, they strip down butt naked, and they just sit there naked with each other. They'll talk about current events, and that's something that when you expose your naked body to your friends and family, it's more intimate, I would say, than here in the West, where we see two naked guys going to a sauna. We immediately think that there's going to be some sodomy, but that's just part of their culture in Sweden, seeing each other naked. So, yeah, I just wanted to chime in about that because we had to mention sodomy in some time. So, yeah. How about you, Jacob?
Sodomy.
Do we know if At the Gates recorded naked?
We do not know.
I'm just kidding.
We can spread around a rumor that they did.
We know that we know Incantation did, or at least Craig Pillard.
Wow.
That,
good times. Good times.
That voice sample at the end of the last song on Onward to Golgotha, it's backmasked. But it's backmasked Craig Pillard saying, "I sang Golgotha in the nude."
Oh yeah. Well, if you look at Demolic, the album's name is The Penis, scrambled up. So, and I'm glad we got to mention some sodomy here. It's been a little, too straight. But
it's been a bit dry on the sodomy. So
yeah.
Let's bring it on.
Yeah, I'm a little too hungry to get into the Heidegger, though. That's pure torment. Being hungover and go into Heideggerian authenticity. So the thingly thing.
Yeah, exactly.
The penis, the thingly penis.
the penisly. The penis is penising.
The penisly penis. Yeah. All right. Speaking about authenticity, Yeah, the Dongan 6.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting inside that Numenon, sodomizing the Numenon. So
Oh yeah, but sorry for interrupting you, Jason. If you had a point.
no, I don't. I was just bullshitting. So go ahead.
Okay, but I do think that because this all this talk about what Scandinavian culture is like, and going back to you and Brett and Paul sort of talking about the culture of Texas, I think that there are some striking differences that should probably be addressed because the Scandinavian. Now I'm almost talking as if Scandinavia is one country, but it really isn't, and we wouldn't like to see it as such. But we are small countries with very small populations and a very large sense of social cohesion. So the fact of different regions and stuff like that isn't really as prevalent in Scandinavia and hasn't been as it is. As I get the impression that it is the case in America. So with the Satan thing and stuff like that, of course you would get small strains of Christian subcultures, and some of them would be more or less extreme. But I think with the adoption of the satanic imagery in the Scandinavian context, that was probably a bit of an influence. I think there was a huge influence from horror movies, as Brett mentioned as well, and of course, lifting that sort of imagery from the forefathers, the classical satanic bands. But if we are to look at it strictly, I think that the rebellion from a Scandinavian metal point of view was more a rebellion towards egalitarianism, because when I grew up and when I was a kid in the 90s, the closest thing I can come up with that would sort of resemble what you guys are talking about with Christianity would more be something like political correctness, because from a statist standpoint and from the viewpoint of society, the Scandinavian countries have always been, in my lifetime at least, almost demonstrably secular. They wouldn't make any sort of religious references in school, and they would be tolerant and inclusive, and thinking about how we can make everyone as equal as possible, and from that you get the sort of emphasis on elitism, I think, from the Norwegians later on. Yeah, but I'm just going a bit off a tangent here. But some thoughts I was having while the sodomy was going on that I thought would maybe be worthwhile to share with you guys.
And Darwinism. I mean, I think one of the big puzzlers for everyone was why the Norwegian bands were always talking about wolves and winter and things dying and battle and stuff like that. A lot of it was the idea of hierarchy emerging naturally through struggle with nature, which I would imagine is, not having lived in the region and not being Scandinavian or one of the Scandinavian cultures, but I imagine that in a place that it's very cold and easy to die, that's probably always at the forefront of your thought. So I always thought that there was, in American metal, I think there might be shades of the Scopes Monkey Trial, where the Christians insisted that everyone had equal souls, and therefore Darwinism couldn't be true. And I think that in the more organized European-style state systems, which sort of follow the Napoleonic model more than the American system has, at least until the 14th Amendment, I think you guys were sort of rebelling against egalitarianism with Darwinism and with naturalism, because egalitarianism is a correction to nature, is the only way to put it. It's designed to make equal what is not naturally equal and cannot be equal, because, of course, in nature you need some sort of Darwinian competition to avoid getting clobbered by mutations from gene drift, essentially. And in the European legal systems, from my distant study, it seems like egalitarianism was built directly into the state because of the French Revolution and because of events preceding that, including the peasant revolts and the Magna Carta and all that good stuff. And as a result, it sort of took the place of religion in America. I mean, we're in the United States broadly, and it's very hard to generalize about a place this big, but broadly, our impulse towards state charity comes from this sort of Christian sense of obligation to the poor and downtrodden and stuff like that. I think in a previous episode, Keith Preston mentioned the city on a hill, which has always been, more even than Protestantism, sort of an American view of our exceptionalism. We're exceptional because we take care of the poor and the downtrodden and all that stuff. And so rebelling against egalitarianism here, which historically would be about the right thing to be happening now, since the end of World War II established egalitarianism as the worldwide order. For us, it may be more expressed in religious terms because that's the root of egalitarianism in America. But in Europe, it seems to me that it came more recently, at least, let's say that, from that French revolutionary narrative and the desire of European nations to avoid having revolutions that destroyed them the way they destroyed France. You know, France went from being perhaps one of the biggest world powers to being sort of forgotten. And that's the consequence of revolutions to a population. And you can see why European nations wish to avoid that. So I think there's definitely an anti-egalitarian spirit in metal, even going back to Black Sabbath. I mean, the hippies were egalitarians. They believed that through pacifism and equality, they could achieve a utopia simply by tolerating everyone and accepting everyone. And I think that the Black Sabbath vision is more of one in which, you know, some people are sane and are headed to good things, and other people are insane and are headed for ruin, and we should probably just laugh at them and or kill them. And it's a different viewpoint entirely, but I think that that's very much baked into metal's DNA. It's also very much baked into punk's DNA. Is this, you know, despite the fact that they're basically anarchists, they're also extremely intolerant of idiots and are very anti-stupidity, which sounds like a ridiculous political platform, like we're the anti-stupid party. I mean, how do you even, you know, say that in public? But it's very much a philosophy that replaces the good versus evil with more of a traditional and to some degree scientific learning versus ignorance, wisdom versus stupidity. And that's sort of what comes in there, you know. And adding to that, the progressive rockers, of course, were naturally elitist. You know, they made this incredibly pretentious music that was designed to alienate the normal population. So all that coming together, I think there's definitely an anti-egalitarian thread in metal. And I can see how in Scandinavia, which was sort of in terms of historical events, coming out of a long-term flirtation through the 60s and 70s with something that was very close to communism, that they're coming out of that statist mindset and into one that's more naturalistic. And we're sort of seeing the same thing in the USA now. People are saying, you know, we're really done with the subsidy state that's trying to save everyone from themselves. We're really interested now more in protecting the people who do good things and ensuring that they get rewarded. And there's very much that it's very much straight out of the Odyssey, that conquest mindset in black metal and in Swedish death metal and possibly Finnish death metal. The winner takes all, because the winner has actually done something useful and everyone else is kind of useless and therefore is a historically unimportant character. So I can definitely see that anti-egalitarian movement you're talking about, and I think it's very important.
Yeah, do you have anything to chime in there, Paul?
Well, I think he finally cut to the core with that anti-egalitarianism, because what I was going to say earlier before Brett got onto that and kind of unified it is that after going into this discussion a bit and talking about the big riff and not going back, 10 minutes in time here, but I don't know, it almost makes me think we can't even talk about Swedish death metal musically as a whole, because there's almost kind of two strains, right? The bands like Nihilist, Unleashed, and God Macabre, for instance, those bands very much were cyclical and were all about the big riff, Unleashed in particular. And then on the other hand, you had the bands descending from Carnage, like Dismember and Therion and whatnot, who were a bit, less that way. However, one thing that is in common with all of those, and I think that is the unifying strain that Brett just got to, is the very explicit heroism and the man who rises above. That is a very constant strain thematically in all of them. And even the kind of bouncier D-beatish bands, Unleashed in particular, they do it in a strain that has that epic flavor to it, which brings that out. So I think that Brett, just kind of answered the questions from earlier there about where it actually comes through. Not even so much in the, we're going to be musical side of things, or we're not going to have one big riff side of things, but we are going to be explicitly heroic about it side of things. Whereas, a band like Incantation, there's a New York band there that's very melodic, not consonant, but very melodically constructed, that does not have those rhythmic accents that other New York bands do, but no one would ever mistake it for a Swedish band. But at the same time, you'll never catch that same heroic strain out of Incantation, whereas you will out of basically any classic Swedish band.
Interesting. Yeah. It's kind of interesting when we talk about the different regional sounds. Of course, everyone knows Norwegian black metal has, their specific style. Then we have American black metal, which is more informed by death metal, as well as, we have the hot spot that is the Florida death metal scene. But you can tell that there's regional influences, like in the New York sound. Like I would say Florida is kind of a mishmash of a lot of different sounds, but I could hear, like with Death's Human album, they were a little influenced by the New York style a little bit, but yeah, when we're talking about the underground scene, it's more of like an umbrella of a lot of different expressions, a lot of different regional expressions, and it's hard to pinpoint like what is the Platonic form of this expression. I've used the Onward to Golgotha as this is the Platonic archetype of death metal, but when we were discussing the Swedish death metal, they have their own Platonic form of death metal, and like you said, there's two different strains. So you have your beer metal side of Unleashed and Grave, and then you have the more serious stuff, like the Carnage, Dismember, and even At the Gates. He was not my favorite band, but I do appreciate how they were serious about how they wove all those micro melodies and tried to communicate something larger. But when we get to like what is the true essence of the underground death metal, there's no singular reference point. It's more of a conglomerate of a lot of different expressions. You could say it's pluralism, but they're all aiming towards transcendence in some degree. Other than the beer metal, which the Grave and the Unleashed is kind of knuckleheaded shit. But any thoughts on that? Like, what is like is there an archetype of what true death metal is, or is it just anyone can approach it from their own specific point of view? Anyone can chime in.
Okay, well, I've answered this on Shelley's blog a million times, and so Jason, I know you're going to be tired of hearing me go into this spiel, but like the archetype for basically all metal period, and the Order of Nine Angles wrote an article a long time ago called on Our Sinister Style, but it applies to metal as much when they say that Satanism is harmful, baleful, pernicious, sly, etc., 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 but that is what metal is and should be at its core, and it should be a celebration of that. So metal and death metal in particular at its core is music that is explicitly a celebration of the harmful, the pernicious, the baleful, the sly, blah, 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 blah. And that is your archetype. If you're making music that is in that direction, there's multiple ways to get there musically, but there you are. If you're doing that, that is... You pretty much have to qualify as death metal at that point. There's really no way to not, at least if you're doing it in an ensemble format with distorted electric guitars and etc. There is your archetype right there, I think.
Would you agree with that, Jacob?
Not entirely, though. I do think that if Paul would permit me to like condense
the archetype as, like a sinister archetype, a reverberation of sinister energy in music or something like that. There is also a definite element that when we got to the point of, rebelling against egalitarianism, for example, that the sinister energy is directed towards a certain type of end, which will in the end be, comparable to, striving to reach something that is more natural or more real than the state that we're in. Where I think that something like a celebration of the sinister as an archetype could also be applied to something like the ethos of a serial killer like Richard Ramirez and stuff like that. While that stuff is very fascinating in its own right, it doesn't really encompass all the different aspects that I see as being interesting and invigorating by listening to metal across all of the regions with the bands that we've been discussing.
Yeah, it's kind of like I can appreciate when people try to get to the quote unquote spirit, which I think Paul was trying to do by calling the archetype being something sinister, like, but yeah, I hate to get into Heidegger about how a piece of artwork can reveal, like his analogy was Van Gogh with the peasant lady, with the shoes of the peasant lady. Like what that reveals to you is, you're being thrown into those shoes. There's like a thrownness when it actually touches you. And metal has the same thing. You're being thrown into the forms, and especially like music, I think has greater potential than any other form of art to have that element of thrownness, especially through a Schopenhauerian sense. And it's hard to pin down exactly what that is in intelligible terms. I know Brett would say nerve impulses or brain impulses, the natural cadence of the mind. And that's where it kind of creates its own dong and sitch. I think there's something ethereal, like you said earlier, Jacob, that if we were able to communicate it with language coherently to each other, then we would have no reason for art. That's why art exists, because there's an aspect that is beyond what we can actually communicate to each other. Would you agree with that, Mr. Stevens?
That's an interesting point. Music exists in part to communicate what we can't put into words because it will be subverted, because words have multiple interpretations where direct nerve impulses kind of do not. At the same time, I think that we should view death metal as a culture. And it's very hard to define what a culture is, but we could start by saying that it's a vocabulary of methods paired with a philosophy of what is good. And I think this defines basically every culture. There are certain ways you do things and you learn how to be proficient at those, but those are directed by what we're going to call ends or goals that correspond to your philosophy. And tying that into Paul's excellent comment, there's a sinister element to metal, but what is the sinister? In my view, the sinister is simply ends over means. If you need to do something, you achieve it however you have to, and you don't worry about morality. Cultures have a vocabulary of methods they like to use, and they have goals that they use them towards. But you can't let the two flip each other. That is, you always need to have the ends be more important than the means. And I think great books of history like the Odyssey, things like classical literature in Europe, almost all of them involve people trying to escape a moralism that is limiting their methods and instead work around that in order to achieve their ends. And that is what I think the sinister is. And I think that's how that's expressed in metal. And naturally, that's anti-egalitarianism. You don't care if things are equal because that's a method. You make things equal so that people get along. You care about the goal. What is the goal? Well, it's whatever is good. And so you need to strive toward that. And the whole point of that is to achieve that state by any means you need to, by any means necessary. And I think that's the essence of metal, where the hippies were pacifists and they really wanted peace above all else. Well, that doesn't really jive with the metal mindset, because peace is a method. It's not a goal in and of itself. And in fact, it's not realistic. And so we reject it inherently. And I think that's where we bond to that sinister viewpoint. Some would say it's immoral. I say it's simply amoral. We view morality as a means to an end. And when it fails to serve that end, we're going to move on and use something else. And this corresponds to a lot of the mythos we see in popular writing. For example, the Wild West mythos, the cowboy stories. The cowboy has to break some rules to bring order to the community. And the Nord Noir, your detective story, the Nords took what Chandler wrote and made it into this wonderful sort of language of its own, this vision. It's a very, very gothic version of the detective story. And it's got a lot of the Wild West in it too, but it's the same thing. Your detectives in those need to know when to transgress against social rules in order to, make things work out. And they aim toward a good end, and therefore they excuse themselves breaking the rules. And we see Trump vocalizing something like that recently too. Sometimes in order to save the world from itself, you have to break some rules. And what he said basically was, if the end result is good, no one's going to care if you broke the rules. And I think that's the essence of the metal morality, if we're going to call it that.
Yeah, anyone want to chime in on the egalitarianism getting sodomized?
Well, not so much on the egalitarianism, but on the language versus music. So I think that this discussion got a little backwards, because most of the recent research indicates that music came for humans before speech and language did. That speech and language started as a subset of music and then turned into their own thing. So it's not that we sing because we've got something we can't express in language. No. Music came first. Singing and music are more integral to us than talking is. Talking is a thing that we did to elucidate specific points, and as society changed, we did it more and more. But singing is actually much more the basis of who we are and how we communicate than talking is.
It's interesting that humans sung to each other before we actually formulated, language. It's kind of like a romanticized picture of history and through our evolution, that just sounds that are soothing, that correlate well to the mind. That's how we have our expression. Sorry, I'm talking out of my ass a little bit. Jacob, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, if to pick up on the Heidegger thread, I think that one of the things that and this was a general tenet of Heideggerian philosophy. He was sort of seeking a way around of some of the most ancient principles in Western philosophy, not to annul them or critique them, but to try to see if it was possible to think of the world in different terms than what had been, ingrained in the metaphysics and the history of metaphysics, going back to the Greeks and of course being filtered through the Christians. And that was, sort of getting around the principle of non-contradiction, as Aristotle stated, that a thing has to be either A or not A. It cannot be both at the same time. That is, to put it in more regular words, that a thing cannot be ethereal, for example, and immensely practical at the same time. You cannot separate or you cannot say that a thing can be something that is immediately contradictory to it. Now, this makes sense, of course, in the terms of normal everyday language, when we're dealing with everyday objects and matters of practicality, that we have to be clear in our communications. So therefore, we cannot say one thing and that thing can be interpreted in numerous different and contradictory ways. But when you get to stuff like the revealing aspects of being exposed to a work of art, for example, or all matters having to do with the quote-unquote spirit of something, including now we're talking about death metal and how there's something even mutually exclusive in the Swedish and the New York approach, for example. Not that all New York bands sound the same, and not that all Swedish bands sound the same, but there are still two different aspects of what may be, in essence, sort of the same type of spirit or ethos or general approach to society and to reality as such. That maybe to get back to the talk about archetypes and stuff like that archetypes, and this is also a fundamentally Jungian conception of the archetype, namely that the archetype exists outside of the readily comprehensible and translatable into language. So when we talk about it, we have to some degree, ascribe it with mutually exclusive properties that would, if we were talking about an everyday object that we were to point to, like a table or chair, it would mean that that object couldn't exist. But in the spirit, or in the terms of the ethereal, it can very well be the point that that something that is seemingly mutually exclusive qualities can both be present in the spirit, so to speak. So when you get back to something like death metal, it can be both a striving towards the good, for example, as Brett would put it, and by doing that, encompassing what would otherwise be said to be, thoroughly sinister elements. Yeah, that would be my way of trying to tie it back to a bit of philosophy there.
Yeah, I'm cursing your name, Jacob, because we got into the Heidegger and a little hungover here. But I was just thinking because are you familiarized with the school? It's very influenced by Heidegger. It's called object-oriented ontology.
No, I've never studied it, but please enlighten me.
Yeah, it's a newer Heideggerian kind of take that's kind of flourishing in academia right now, where it views everything as an object, even imaginary things. If we can conceptualize it like a fictional character, that itself is real. But it's like an inversion of transcendental idealism, where everything knowable is the subject, but it's taken everything as Timothy Morton. He uses his analogy of hyper objects, where we can only know like a little bit of an object. There's this greater object that we just haven't fully realized yet with our minds. You look at global, like, climate change. We know the Earth goes through different phases. It warms and cools and all that, but there could be more elements to that than what we know. And so it's just like the object-oriented ontology, especially with Timothy Morton, with how they, that's the preferred pronoun, is they like to conceptualize it as, just like the tip of the iceberg. There's this greater structure to the objects, but the main thing about object-oriented ontology is everything is object. And with that, you can connect, with objects a little bit more. Like analogy is Zuhanden and Vorhanden. I forget which one. There's a state like you turn on a light switch. You may passively be touching the light switch, not really thinking about it. You're thinking about the lights turning on, but once you actually become aware of that light switch, you're kind of thrown into it in an ontological sense. But that's me hungoverly trying to elaborate on object-oriented ontology. But for metal, I think I'm more with the classicists, where everything knowable is the subject, and metal becomes a part of you if you give yourself to it in that aspect, rather than it just being, a hyper object. Go ahead, Mr. Stevens.
In an occult sense, there is no independence between object and subject, meaning that the two modify each other. And this is the root of esotericism, which is that you're not going to recognize a concept until you know how to recognize it. And you're not going to get on to the next concept in the whatever path you're on until you've completed the previous step and understand it enough that you can recognize what you need next. And when we look at it that way, what we're seeing in metal almost is an assertion of spirit over objects, meaning that only spirit can unify those stages. The desire, the impetus to discover the patterns of objects such that you can figure out what the next stage is that you have to go to. And so I think in that sense, if we had to formulate a metal philosophy, it would be one based exclusively on ends over means, and therefore on spirit or intentions and the intuition to derive them.
Any follow on, Jacob? I know this is your forte here at the philosophy.
Yeah, but I think it's a tricky subject, but it's also very, very interesting to discuss. I hate to get back to Carl Gustav Jung here, but we are talking about archetypes, and I think Jung was fundamentally and very deeply influenced by reading Kant as a young man, and he states so himself in his autobiography. And as we know, the tenets of transcendental idealism is that it's that subject-object distinction, and that whenever there's an object, there's a subject. Whenever there's something that is to be known, there's also posited a knower. So the two can sort of be said to presuppose each other. But Jung says that with the case of something representing or reflecting a psychological archetype, then we are dealing with something that is partly reaching down into our unconscious levels of being, and therefore it only appears in the subject-object categorical distinction as sort of like the tip of an iceberg. And as the tip of an iceberg, we are sort of identifying the object as something being out there in the world. In this case, we are listening to metal music. It's a form of popular music that grew to fruition during the latter half of the 20th century, and so on and so forth. It employs these types of techniques and lyrical subject matter and stuff like that. All that stuff is to be categorized. It can be placed into mental containers, but the archetype also has the invisible part of the iceberg, which isn't readily discernible in the subject-object schema. So you get qualities that are seemingly coming from within yourself, but are sort of projected onto. I use the quotes here. They are perceived as being in the object, but they are also at the same time felt as being within yourself. And I think as far as a metal spirit goes, this is something that I think it's an interesting idea to consider when we listen to metal and are really sucked into the world of what that music expresses and all the things that it means. It means peeling away of layers of perception, and it speaks to us on an intellectual level and an analytical level, but also on a profoundly emotional level and a level of pure energy almost. And it is hard to distinguish and to separate out what is it that exactly makes it so awesome, not as subjective or as objective, but as the way that the object seemingly reaches down into our subject and beneath that even to bring something to mind that arises from the depths, so to speak.
Yeah, and it could be like a communion with the shadow as well, bringing that to, confronting the nastiness from, within, and bringing that to the forefront to apprehend it. Any thoughts on Jung, Paul, or Brett?
I'll just say one last thing about that Timothy guy. Everything being an object seems like kind of a dumbass attempt at inverting Plato. Leave it to the academics to fuck everything up that badly. At any rate, I got to go because the Opfer is coming for the sacrifice at any moment, so got to get ready for the call.
All right, all right. Got some human sacrifice going on there. Great having you on, Paul. I guess
Good
on
to
this
be here.
side, yeah, we can wrap up. We've been chatting almost for an hour and 30 minutes. So, Paul, thank you very much. Jacob, great insights today, Jacob. I love you.
Thank you. I love you too.
Oh, I am like 4% Danish, and you make me proud of that 4%.
Oh yeah, it's the subconscious resonance there.
Yeah. And also, Mr. Stevens, you were talking about the different demographics in Texas, but my Czech and German heritage comes from Shiner. So the Czechs and Germans used to congregate together. You know, the part of the hill country, especially like Fredericksburg, is 100. You know, that was a German community, as was Bernie. But the Shiner, Texas, is a mixture of Czech and German. Good times, good times. Thank you, Mr. Sodomizer.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure as always.
Yeah, and thank you for listening to the NADS, the Necropolis AD show.